Well, greetings. We want to welcome viewers today to today's webinar, How to be Financially Hopeful in the Pastoral Role During and Beyond a Pandemic, co-sponsored by Wesleyan Publishing House and Education and Clergy Development. Today we will be talking with our special guest, Dr. Mark Rennaker. And if you allow me to, I would like to share a little bit about Dr. Rennaker. He's the grant director for our Thrive Financial Initiative program in the Wesleyan Church, working with the Lilly Endowment to manage the denomination support funds from the endowment. He also helped launch the Thrive Financial Initiative denomination wide in 2016. He directed a pilot project called the Hope Project in Indiana that established the foundation for the current Thrive Financial Initiative. He served as a pastor in the Wesleyan Church for 30 years, and also currently he's serving as the department chair in leadership studies at Indiana Wesleyan University. So welcome, Dr. Rennaker. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And we would like to ask you some questions in regards to, how to be financially hopeful during this time, especially for pastors. So uh, if I can ask you, how is the financial situation of many pastors in churches during this pandemic season? And how do you think it impacts our pastors?
Sure. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you for the opening. You can feel free to call me Mark and not Dr. Rennaker. I'm good with that. So,
Okay.
um, well, it's an excellent question, and the answer really, I think, is it depends. It's one of the things that I've noted in conversations with pastors and my colleagues that very much church by church, region by region is the way that we would have to answer that around the pandemic. In the initial stages of COVID, when churches first began to move more to virtual worship settings or virtual worship settings without face-to-face environments, there was some initial grave concern about finances. In many instances, giving in local churches dropped significantly in the short time. And I think part of that was there was a belief we all had, I think, that this was just going to be temporary. It was going to be a couple of weeks and then back to our normal way of worshiping, and perhaps congregants, withheld tithes and offerings in waiting for to go back to face services in order to make those contributions. So some of those conversations in that first month with pastors really painted some dire circumstances. A lot of churches are on razor thin budgets. They're on razor thin cash reserves. And though they were able to make the first utility payment, they were worried about the one a month from now, 2 months from now, if the giving trends as they were continued. And so some pastors were quite concerned. But churches have adapted and have adapted in marvelous ways, especially as it comes to giving. More churches have online giving options today than a year ago, or when the COVID pandemic really began to spread. They've worked out mail-in options for some of the older folks who don't want to do online giving. There's even, I've heard of drop-off options where people can at certain times come and drop off their tithes and offerings at the church. And beyond just the virtual way of worshiping, as we know, churches have done drive-in services and all sorts of creativity in how they're doing worship, and consequently how they're receiving funds. And as a result, in a lot of places, it's stabilized. In fact, I've had churches, pastors tell me that they're actually more strong financially right now than they were heading into the COVID pandemic. Not just on giving patterns, but for instance, in the state of Indiana, there were numerous grants that were available. One, for instance, from the Center for Congregations, $5,000 that was available to upgrade technology. Some churches took advantage of the payroll protection legislation from Congress, and those are just a couple of examples of the other support that's out there. And I always encourage churches to go look for that. There were, beyond the Center for Congregations, there were other sources providing grants to assist churches, and churches that were able to take advantage of that, churches that perhaps saw their giving go up, again, talk about finances being stronger. But that's not always the case. In some other places, it is quite the opposite. Giving patterns have not returned to normal, whatever that may be. And especially in situations where maybe the major employer of a town is a single factory or a single industry or a single type of work environment where jobs have been lost, or the factory is shut down, or hours have been reduced significantly. It's possible the large number of the church congregants, that's where they were working, receiving income, and now their income is not the same, and the church's income therefore is not the same. So what I like to say, in addition to it depends, is this: in some sense, whatever your church is experiencing is actually somewhat normal, whether it's experiencing an increase in giving, a decrease in giving, or even very similar patterns to what it was before. We can find plenty of examples of churches just like yours that are experiencing things just like yours. And I think one of the things the pandemic has not changed in that regard is, wrestling with what does it mean to be a good steward? What does it mean to be strategic in our thinking based upon where we are at right now? If we're receiving more income, then we need to be good stewards with that. And if we are receiving less income, then we need to figure out the steward implications for that. I think, the second piece of your question perhaps is then how does that impact pastors? Right? We can talk about the church environment. But how does that impact pastors? And there's a factor that really hasn't changed, whether we're talking before the pandemic hit, in the midst of the pandemic, or when we're looking to well beyond the pandemic, that a pastor's economic situation is directly tied to that of the church. Right? They're a part of that system. So if you have a situation where a church's finances are weak or growing weaker, that has a definitive impact on the pastor. And hopefully, I'd like to believe the reverse is true. If the church's finances are strong or growing stronger, that is some opportunity or benefit for the pastor. And there's two ways to think about that impact, what I like to call the professional context and the personal context. The professional context is the pastor is the leader of the church. In many cases, the chair of the board. You might consider them somewhat CEO-like in that role, and they are running an organization from that perspective with weakening finances. That has a professional impact on them in a number of ways. But they also receive their compensation from that organization, from the church. Yeah. And so there has a personal impact on them as well. If budget cuts start to get made, pastor's compensation salary is one of those things, and frequently one of the first things that gets looked at for a reduction in order to try to stabilize the situation. It's been that way for some time. The pandemic has heightened that, I think, in some ways. We have about 10 to 12 years of research now under our belt. Collectively as the sort of the church universal. Auburn University did some studies 12 to 15 years ago. A Lutheran a bishop developed some research on a model about 12 years ago. Lilly got on board, Lilly Endowment got on board and started funding lots of research, including the pilot project in Indiana, Matt Bloom's work in Flourishing in Ministry at Notre Dame, the Association of Theological Schools, a look at how theological education is financed. And then Lilly launched this nationwide economic challenges facing pastoral leaders back in 2015, 2016, to where about 50 different denominations or regional groups are involved in that, which comprises about 200,000 congregations in the United States or in North America, or about 2/3 of all congregations. So research has been filtering through all of that. And the research shows time and time again that pastors' economic challenges are often extreme or severe. Their conditions are weak. That's before pandemic, in pandemic, after pandemic. That hasn't necessarily changed that. But here I think is we're looking for reasons for hope in and beyond. I think here's one thing to consider. The pandemic has stimulated a lot of creativity in churches. Creativity in how they do worship, creativity in how they collect funds. And it means there's an opportunity for creativity and how we wrestle with pastors' economic challenges as well as the challenges of our laity. So the context depends, could be strong, could be weak. Pastors tend to follow, but it's a creative context that we need to figure out how to take advantage of for this issue as well.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rennaker. And it is so true that, once the pandemic is over, there are going to be same situations that are happening. And that's the question that I want to ask you right now, which is in regards to the cycle of despair. In your book, Hope for Pastors, you share a little bit about that. So can you please share with us how a pastor can become aware and where they are right now?
Yeah. Well, I would say this. If a pastor is caught in this cycle of despair, they know that they're there. Um, it may not have a name given to it, and that's one of the symptoms of the cycle of despair is this sense of it's just me or isolation. So let me start with sort of how we developed this picture in our research that resulted in this, what you see on the screen, and this phrase called the cycle of despair. When we first began our research, and again, this was 10, 12 years ago, no one was really doing this. It was such a new area. We started asking pastors about their economic conditions, their economic challenges, those financial issues. And within the Wesleyan denomination, we were able to come up with a list of 32 separate challenges that pastors articulated that they were experiencing. Not every pastor had every one. And for some were more or some were less, but from our most pastors would talk about at least one or two or three economic challenges that seem to be extremely significant for them. So 32 economic challenges. I won't go through all the lists, but it's things that won't surprise, I think, our listeners. And at least one of these they're probably wrestling with or have wrestled with, debt as just a sort of a catch-all category, whether that's credit card debt or auto debt or mortgage debt or education debt, which was actually the issue that Lilly was interested in first. What their research had uncovered, that pastors tended to accumulate education debt when compared as a ratio to their future income potential, scared the Lilly Endowment of what they were seeing in terms of the amount of education, the amount of debt that was being accumulated. Sometimes was on par with doctors or lawyers or other professionals with similar levels of education, but the income potential was not there. And so, beyond debt, it was things, again, that won't surprise our listeners: medical expenses, whether that's premiums, deductibles, out of pocket, all those things that come along with that. Transportation, buying a car or maintaining a car or a second vehicle. Housing issues. The church-owned parsonage sounds like a good thing, and it is in some circumstances, but also has some very negative long-term impacts if not thought through carefully. Pension. Actually, the first research I did in this was looking at pension levels in a district, and 68% of pastors either had unfunded or underfunded pensions within that district, and that's actually fairly common. A lack of funds for leadership or professional development, or to buy books or to buy computers or keep computers up to date, or software and other things that are essential for ministry. So we can go on and on. I mean, that list is fairly exhaustive, and it's mentioned in the book and some other sources that we have out there through the TFI project. So you've got these challenges that each pastor seems to face in some regard. But that is not the entire picture. We can very easily stop at that and say, well, we've just got to go fix these challenges. But we need to dive a little deeper into two categories. One is results and one is impacts. And by results, what we referred to was, what happens as a result of having this economic challenge. So let's take debt, for example. Let's take education debt, for example. If someone has a high amount of education debt that they are making a $300 or $400 or $500 or $600 payment on each month, that money is going to the education debt and tends to result in a cascade effect in other areas. Right? They have less money for food. They
Yeah.
have less money for housing. They have less money for utilities. They have less money for transportation. And so frequently that one debt leads to another debt or a way of dealing with those things. So there was these myriad of results that we began to uncover. Pastors told us that they could really only afford to keep one reliable vehicle. So
Wow.
what happens when the spouse or the family has that vehicle and a ministry emergency arises? And the pastor has to say, well, I'll be at the hospital as soon as I get the car back. So there were these results that challenges sort of led to. So you can just talk about debt, or you can just talk about medical expenses, but they impact other things, which the word impact then is more related to psychological, emotional, spiritual, relational, even physical impacts that emerge from having these challenges, dealing with the results, and having that over time. And so impacts, the word stress would be the single most frequent word that pastors would talk about, this heightened sense of stress because they were dealing with these issues day after day after day. But that wasn't it. They talked about the stress leading to reduced energy and enthusiasm for ministry, even at times leading
Wow.
to cynicism, anger, pessimism, and then feeling guilty about having cynicism, anger, and pessimism. Even shame that they are experiencing these economic challenges. This isolation that I talked about, somehow feeling it's only them because it doesn't appear to them that their peers are wrestling with quite the same things because nobody's talking about it, which led on the side of the diagram, you can see this silence piece. Another term we use is this conspiracy of silence. The pastors often suffer through these issues somewhat silently, not sure how to bring them up, because bringing them up, the shame piece, but bringing them up exposes them to claims of, well, where's your spirituality? And their own feelings of where's my spirituality if I'm even worried about something like money. So it's just this, you get caught in this downward cycle, not sure how to get out of it, where challenges lead to more challenges, leads to results, leads to negative psychological, emotional, spiritual states. And it's all cloaked in this silence because we aren't talking about it. And that was one of the single biggest findings from all the research that's been done. Now, this just isn't a Wesleyan thing, right? There's over 50 denominations that are involved in the Lilly and Endowment Project, representing over 200,000 congregations. So we're talking, I've been in meetings with Lutherans and Presbyterians and Mennonites and Quakers and Methodists and Baptists and Nazarenes and Catholics. That's almost universal. Sometimes a specific issue is larger or smaller than another place, or contextual factors matter, but this challenges to results to impacts, the cycle despair, the silence is universal. And I think when we talk about what has the pandemic done, it has heightened some of that a bit. It has heightened some feelings of despair. It's heightened some feelings of depression and shame and isolation, because we all are struggling with lots of things that have been added to our plate, if you will.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rennaker. And it is very sad to learn about this cycle of despair. But the good news is that I love how you shared in your book about the cycle of the hope cycle. So, can you help us to understand what the hope cycle and what it is, that hope cycle, and how the pastors can incorporate it in their lives now?
Yeah, yeah. It's again, the hope cycle was something that emerged out of that early research, and hope was actually an acronym back then from the words that pastors used when we just began to talk about these issues. Right, the conspiracy of silence. Just raising the issues in research, they used words that about encouragement, such as help, opportunities, possibilities, education. So those four words, help, opportunities, possibilities, and education, became the acronym for hope back at that point in time. And I think today we might even refer to it as the thrive cycle. as we talk about the Thrive Financial Initiative. And it became a way that we talked about a response pattern that we began to see in local churches, in part, because of the program and the ideas that we were putting together, but it really wasn't about us. It was about what was happening in the local congregation when this flow began to reverse, when we began to be able to break this conspiracy of silence and move the downward sort of cycle of despair and began to change its direction. There were several pieces that were part of that. And the single biggest one that you see in the bottom of the screen is the idea of awareness. We figured out a way to talk about these issues in the local church, in the district context, right? That they were no longer just under the rug, swept under the rug or hidden, but we started talking about them, because what we discovered was laity didn't really know. When we did our research, we did research with laity as well, and they were shocked and astonished. And the way I've said it sometimes was to discover that pastors are people too. That pastors also have economic concerns. They had these implied or implicit ideas that pastors were above that pastors didn't lay awake at night wondering how they were going to pay a bill or dealing with whatever the issue may be. And so there was an awareness issue and a shock and a surprise issue that came out, and just breaking that silence. Breaking that conspiracy of silence is the most essential thing. Somehow finding courage to talk about the issues, somehow finding, in ourselves that love for one another, that bear one another's burdens, the trust that we need to happen, which means it's often the emergence of one person. One lay person in the local church context can change everything. We like to call them the hope champion or the thrive champion or the thrive advocate. It's one person who gets, in this trust relationship with the pastor and begins to learn more about these issues and understand them, not just in the pastor alone, but that these are issues that engulf the entire congregation. Exactly. The laity have debt too. The laity have medical issues too. The laity have transportation issues too. So this isn't about separating and pulling them apart. This conspiracy of silence has done that. This is about finding ways for us to think together, how we are in this together, which led to that second piece, collaboration. As soon as we had some champions that began to really speak on behalf of the pastor, how does the pastor really raise this issue with his church board or her church board? Very difficult to do. Not impossible, but difficult. So that champion person could really begin to change things and start a conversation, break the silence, and start collaboration, working together creatively. So what are we going to do here? And by the way, I think there's hope and opportunity in the pandemic. The pandemic has actually made it easier to bring these issues up because they aren't as unexpected as they were in the past. Even laity recognize we all have some challenges. And so there is hope within and beyond the pandemic on these issues. We have an environmental factor that actually helps us talk about these more freely than we did in the past. I wish we didn't have the pandemic, but let's think strategically and let's take advantage of it. This is something you can use to raise these conversations. And so as that awareness and collaboration grows and thinking creatively grows, they begin to work together to come up with some solutions. It's often not a matter of let's write a check and fix it. One, that's usually not possible. And two, it's usually actually not the best thing to do. But finding small ways that you can do this and you can do that, and that build upon each other and add upon each other and compound upon each other over time actually makes a difference. One of my favorite stories is a local church who discovered that debt was an issue, not just for their pastor as they broke the silence and talked about it, but the laity too, and the church itself. And so they began to work together and think together about how we can tackle this debt problem. And within just 2 to 3 years, they had paid off hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt collectively, helping the pastor, doing it themselves. And as they did it themselves, they were able to give more to the church, pay off the church debt. And as that went away, they had more money for ministry and began to be able to reach out. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep our eyes on. The ultimate goal here isn't really about money. It's about expanded ministry. It's about freeing ministers, freeing laity. It's about thriving clergy, thriving congregations, thriving communities. And money is so often at the heart of what creates shackles and difficulty in that. So the third piece, and I'll get through these quickly. I know we're about out of time. From the awareness to collaboration is education. Pastors have told us over and over again that, as they did their ministerial training, they didn't have a lot of classes, if any, on financial matters, on financial management of a church, or even their own personal financial
Right.
management. And they've said, I need education, I need information here. And so education is a key piece. In many small churches, treasurers are not trained accountants. Education is important. Now, that's not saying anything bad about pastors. It's not saying anything bad about laity or treasurers. It's just the reality. The more we can become educated on these things, the more we put tools at our disposal to make a difference and how to do budgeting and so forth. And so we've been blessed with some incredible partners, as you know. Um, the Ron Blue Institute has provided some assistance through God Owns It All, Master Your Money, and some other items. ECFA, or the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, has a free membership to a website with just tons of free materials and webinars and ebooks for pastors and churches and budgeting and finance and treasurers. Thrivent Financial has made available anyone who's participating in our TFI. In year 2 of that, they can start a financial counseling relationship with a certified financial counselor from Thrivent at no charge to the pastor, and can work with you and your spouse for several years. Actually, having someone in your corner, someone who's an expert in this to help guide you, and it's often that's a huge. Just having somebody come alongside who often can tell you it's not as bad as you think it is. Let's just do this and this, and then finally, some enhanced financial support. Often it's not possible to make a significant line item budget change in a church, or again, just write that check, but finding a way to make a small change, finding a way to do creative things, to provide labor in kind or other creative ways to create some relief. And as churches do that in our TFI program, there's incentive funds, there's grant funds that, again, don't fix the problem with one fell swoop. But if you do this year over year over year, the education, the contributions, receiving the grants, the collaboration, you change the culture of the church. You change the financial conditions of the church, and you improve the financial conditions of the pastor, and that's room for hope. So again, I just want to say, let's be clear. This is actually not about prioritizing money or the material things. It's quite the reverse. It's about prioritizing people, pastors and laity alike. It's about prioritizing ministry, finding ways to cast off the shackles that keep us from doing effective ministry. So it's about hope. It's about thriving. It's actually about seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And that is reason to be hopeful, not just in the pandemic, but beyond it. There are opportunities here to collaborate, to become aware, to be creative, to work together, and to be stronger when we come out on the other side of this for greater ministry, for thriving clergy, congregations, and communities.
Thank you, Dr. Rennaker. It's such a blessing to be able to hear you and to hear that hope that we all pastors can see at the end of the tunnel. So thank you so much. I want to thank all of you that participated in this webinar. Our book giveaway winner is Belinda Selfridge. Thank you, Pastor Belinda, for being with us. She will be receiving a free copy of the Hope for Pastors from Wesleyan Publishing House, and we will contact you directly for information about this book. But before we leave, I would like to ask Dr. Rennaker, and I'm sorry, I cannot, it's very difficult not to say doctor. Could you share how people can get a hold of you and learn more about your book and your work, and also TFI that you mentioned immensely?
Great. Well, and there's another slide I think they're going to post here in just a moment that has a couple of email addresses for me. One Wesleyan email address, so Rennaker M@wesleyan.org. You can feel free to email email me there. My university email is probably the one I check most frequently. I'm on it constantly. So mark.rennaker at indwes.edu, indwes.edu. We also have the web page for the TFI project. You can get to it just to the Wesleyan page and the resources, but there is a direct link to that at wesleyan.org / TFI. The book is available through the Wesleyan Publishing House. All the proceeds from that funnel right back into the TFI project to continue to replenish that pool for giving grants. So those are three ways. I don't see my email addresses on there, but rennakerm@wesleyan.org or mark.rennaker at indwes.edu. So either one of those will work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the privilege to have you and for what you have done and wonderful things. So thank you to all for watching and have a wonderful day.
All right. Thank you, Johanna.